guys, Ashlane here, coming at you today with another variation of the Hog Cycle deck. It is probably the cheapest and most effective deck in the game right now. In the recent tournament, the ELS tournament this weekend, man, we saw a lot of these cycle decks. I did not take part in the tournament, however, I did watch and root on and cheer on some of my clanmates. I was not able to carve away those 4 or 5 hours needed to participate. But anyway, I wanted to bring you a new variation of the Hog Cycle deck. I'm actually liking this one better than the deck I was playing in the Helsinki tournament, and the reason is because we have the Elixir collector added to the deck. I'm just going to kind of run through all the cards. You saw arrows, you saw skeletons. Hog Rider is obviously the bread and butter of this deck. You have archers, which I now prefer over the princess, believe it or not. We'll talk about why when we get to the replays. I have the goblins, which are a high DPS ground unit, obviously very low cost. High DPS air unit are my minions. I exchanged my Minion Horde for minions, and I exchanged the cannon for the Elixir pump. Those are the main exchanges in terms of Elixir swaps I've made. The average Elixir cost of the deck is still 2.9. I still have the Zap, which goes along perfectly with the Hog. I'm still preferring Zap spell over Freeze spell in my cycle decks. Now, a lot of people are saying that the cycle decks don't necessarily require a ton of skill. However, that is absolutely incorrect. These decks require a ton of skill because essentially it requires really quick thinking because you're making so many plays, way more plays than anybody else using a normal Elixir cost deck are going to be using per second. You're making sometimes 2 or 3 plays, especially when it gets down to double Elixir time. So at this point, I'm going to play things really carefully, defensively early on here. I want to see what kind of cards my opponent has. You can see once I find that he has the Inferno Tower and the Elixir Pump, I'm kind of figuring he has a Mortar deck, so I'm ready for it. And by that, I mean that I never want to leave myself with 2 little cards when I know he might have the Mortar card in his hand. And at the same time, I want to make sure I deploy my Elixir Collectors right about where that one is so I can distract the Mortars the entire match. Obviously, you would much rather have the Mortar hit your Elixir Collector versus your Crown Tower. That's just common sense. So I do want to talk about value trades a little bit in this episode as well, and I do want to recap what the fundamentals of a cycle deck are in case you'd missed my first cycle deck video. A lot of you guys have been giving a ton of positive feedback about that video, about the cycle deck, and a lot of you guys saw me using it in the Helsinki tournament to get to the final 8, and yeah, so you guys are having a lot of success with it. So let me just go over the fundamentals in case you missed that video. I will also go ahead and put the link to that video in the description below. So the fundamentals of a cycle deck are very simple, right? So all the Elixir cost cards are very low, all the Elixir cost on these cards in this deck, and the idea is you're essentially cycling onto both the Elixir Collector and, more importantly, the Hog in terms of offense/defense. Now, the reason the Elixir Collector has been added to this deck in exchange for the cannon is because the Elixir Collector serves a lot of the same purposes as the cannon does, right? So the cannon used to go kind of where the Elixir Collector is right now. You can see he can't play his Mortar right now, even though he has it in his hand, because that will be a bad value trade for him at this point. So I'm just going to keep doing my thing here, keep cycling that Hog in. When you have the Hog up, most of the time you want to play it. I mean, obviously, you don't want to play it when you know they're full on Elixir and you have no obvious lane, but the idea here is it is a Hog Cycle deck, so you want to make the opponent always stay on their toes and think of an answer for that Hog Rider card. Now, the Elixir Collector is absolutely an amazing switch in this deck. At this point, I'm trying to get the next Elixir Collector up, so I have it up right now there just in the nick of time to distract that Mortar. He's giving me the sad face, and the idea here is now I have I'm playing things really safe here. You can see I'm not being too aggressive. For a Hog Cycle deck, you would think I might be a little bit more aggressive, but that's not the case necessarily, because now that I'm in the double Elixir last minute, and you can see I now have 3 Elixir pumps, there's not going to be anything he's going to be able to throw at me that I'm not going to be able to defend. So at this point in my mind, I know worst case scenario, I'm playing for a draw, and I know he doesn't have arrows. He only has this, oh, he does have arrows, excuse me. He doesn't have arrows up is what I meant. And I was able to take advantage when he used those arrows early. I mean, that's one of the biggest things you have to learn with this deck, is when your opponent has the arrows up and when they just use their arrows. When they just use their arrows, you are totally free to throw down some goblins, throw down some minions. You can see my battle log here is looking great. I think I've won 6 out of the last 7. I think I might have a draw or 2 in here as well. But it's just such a solid winning deck, and it's one of those decks that the more you go ahead and play it, the better you're going to get with it. So that's the beauty of the deck, just like any deck really. But look at this hand I have right here. So this is a hand, last game we played defensively at the start. This time we play a little bit more offensively because we started with a perfect hand. That means we had the Hog, we had the Zap Spell, we had Goblins. If you have the Hog, Goblins, and Zap Spell, go ahead and play the 3 all together, and that what you can do there is you can kind of test out what cards your opponent has. They might use arrows, if you play, or you can play the minions. You might be able to lure an arrow out of them, then you know they have arrows. They might put down a prince or something, and you know they have a heavier, hefty, high elixir cost deck. You can tell a lot about the deck depending on what your opponent, how your opponent reacts to that really quick push that you do if you start with that opening hand. So if I do start with the Hogs and the Zap Spell, I will use the Hog, the Zap Spell, in 1 ground unit. You don't want to stretch yourself too thin by throwing down minions and goblins, for example, and the Hog and the Zap Spell, because then you leave yourself susceptible to an offensive counter push or defensive counter push on their part. So here you can see I already have a tower down. It's been just over a minute in the match. Already have one of their tower downs. He has a golem. He has a more pricey deck. He has 3 musketeers. He has golem. He has the Valkyrie. He has balloon, Minion Horde. So definitely a pricey deck in terms of expenses. And I have a really cheap deck, and I still have the Elixir Collector. So the idea here is when you get to the last minute, then you have 1 or 2 or even 3, as you saw last match, Elixir Collectors on the board. With this deck, you can counter absolutely anything your opponent throws at them. And it's important too to use the Zap Spell if you have to on defense. I mean, by all means, make sure you use every card available to you defensively if you have to. Even the Hog Rider to distract a P.E.K.K.A. or something like that there. So you can see I don't even have the Zap Spell up right now, and I set the Hog in because that was what I was touching on in the first replay rather, is that it's important to always test your opponent. Sometimes you just don't know if they have anything that they can play against a Hog to immediately counter it. I know he has the Elixir Collector, the Balloon, the Valkyrie, the Golem. I know he has a lot of cards that don't counter the Hog well, so I want to keep testing him. Whenever I have that Hog up, I want to test him. I want to see what he has for an answer. Again, I'm playing the Hog immediately, and he's saying, wow, well played. He could play the Minion Horde, he does, but I'm ready with a Zap Spell again. I get an extra 2 hits off of that Zap Spell. Sometimes you can get a 3 hits if you can time it just absolutely perfectly. Sometimes if you time it really poorly, you can only get 1 extra hit. But either way, 1 extra hit is essentially what, like 250 for a level 8 Hog, 250 hit points or so. So you can see another good win there by myself. I'm gonna go ahead and do one more replay just to get a feel. I want to try to pick 3 different decks. Let's go against another Cycle deck here, and this is actually going to be a good replay to share with you guys because this is going to be a good compare and contrast because he has the cannon like I used to have, and he has the princess instead of the archers. So we're going to show you why I prefer the archers over the princess. Now the archers, obviously you guys are aware of the comparing and contrasting archers versus princess, and it's all about value trading, right? So the archers cannot be taken out by the arrow card. And since I took out the princess in my deck, that gives 1 less thing for them to use arrows against me on. And then what I did was to adjust, because I took out the princess, which is a great arrow counter card, I also took out the Minion Horde. What that leaves is a kind of a vacuum there for my opponent to have to decide. Do I want to use a 3-cost arrow against a 3-cost minion? Do I want to use 3-cost arrow against goblins, against a skeleton? What exactly am I using it on? I can't use it against archers because it won't kill archers, so there's no good value trade there for the opponent, so it leaves the opponent always guessing. You can see my archers stay alive there, and they actually take down the Hog. That's the whole idea behind this deck. This match actually goes way into overtime because Iron Sam is a really good player, and hopefully so am I, so we're really trading tit for tat this entire match, and eventually I pull out the victory. But you can see how it's a grind with this deck. You can't be too aggressive. You have to know what your opponent has in terms of elixir. You have to try to maintain that elixir advantage at all times. That's why you have the Elixir Collector in this deck now. I'll tell you guys, you can lose. You can't ever sit back with this deck and just play super defensively or get your mind out of the game. You have to have your mind always glued to the screen and know what cards best counter other cards. You have to learn how to use the Zap Spell defensively as well as offensively. You have to learn when not to use the Zap Spell. You have to learn when not to use all your cards at the same time. For example, Sometimes it's very tempting with a cycle deck to put down the Hog, and then, like I said before, put down archers, minions, quickly put down goblins, put down skeletons, put it all down, and make a huge, big offensive push. That's not what you're going to want to do with this deck. That's not what that's not how the deck is built. That's not where you're going to get the best bang out of your buck. You need those small, cheap defensive cards such as goblins and skeletons to play defense with almost as much as you need them offensively. So even though it seems like you have a lot of Elixir and you might have the Elixir advantage, that doesn't necessarily mean you always want to just spam a lane with all your cheap units. You have to keep them for defense. And you'll learn little tips or two, like skeletons can take out a prince. So that is really, especially if it's on your side of the map, so you have your tower also engaged with a prince. So if you catch a prince in a charge, that's a really easy stop. You can go ahead and distract with skeletons towards the center of the map, and then between that one cost skeleton and that tower with backup fire, you'll take down that prince. A dark prince, how do you counter a dark prince? Well, you have to distract it oftentimes with a skeleton, but of course it's going to take down that skeleton in one hit. So that's why you can use your minions or even the archers. Another reason I love the archers is they're so much more powerful than the princess against those stronger pushes. So oftentimes you can see where my 2 elixir pumps are and my right hut is right. Excuse me, my right tower is right now. You can see I'll play the archers right to the left of that tower in between the elixir pump and the tower. They do great defensive work. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this second video on the cycle deck. Love this deck. Hope you guys do too. Luckily, none of the cards are epic or legendary, so hopefully more of you guys can use this variation of the deck. So thank you so much for watching. Good luck, and as always, take care, guys.
We don't play for fame, we don't play for cash. We just play for the glory and the crash of the ash.